Damaged Defenders by Charles Xavier. Chapter 8. Steve and Logan. Mutants and mutations hadn't really been a thing in the 30s and 40s. If they had existed at all then, they'd been very few in number and had kept their heads way down. Either that or Steve had been entirely too caught up in surviving his poor health and the depression, then the war, to notice. So while Steve had gotten the short explanation from Tony and a warning that some of the so-called X-Men were unusual looking, he really hadn't been prepared for the reality. The ones that had disembarked from their jet had looked completely normal from a distance. Until, that is, the one codenamed Beast came into view. Steve had been helpless to do anything but stare for a moment, and not because he was horrified. Dr. Hank McCoy, as it turned out, was enormous and best resembled an oversized gorilla with wide shoulders, long arms, and heavy muscles. A gorilla with long, bright blue fur and a mostly human face. A body that large and muscular ought to have been slow and ponderous. The seeming cross between man and animal should have looked monstrous to the eye. But McCoy moved with grace, agility, and precision. His face was alight with intelligence and good humor, transforming himself. What should have been a horrifying monster instead became something wondrous, a delight to the eye that made the artist in Steve positively itch for pencil and paper. And then there'd been Gambit, with the startling eyes and a fierce, defiant, independent attitude that reminded Steve of more than a few of his commandos, who apparently didn't have a spine if the acrobatics he pulled off during the fight were any indication. Steve had gotten pretty good after the serum at taking full advantage of what his body was capable of in a fight, but Gambit pulled off moves that Steve was fairly sure Olympic gymnasts couldn't touch. He was going to be doing a lot of drawing later. When the fight was finally over and the remains of the Chitauri army had collapsed, the defenders who'd been on street level started gravitating towards where Steve, Gambit, Cyclops, and Jean had ended up. A few moments after that, Tony's voice came over the comm. Right, everyone over the tower. It's mostly intact, save for some cosmetic damage. I'll go talk Holt down and bring Banner back in. That sounded like as good a plan as any to Steve, so he turned and headed towards Stark Tower. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. If you would please enter the elevator with the door standing open, a voice said. Steve jumped and looked around, startled. Who? He started. From behind him came an amused sound from someone. I am Jarvis, Captain Rogers. A very sophisticated computer program, to put it in terms that you will understand, that can think for itself. The proper modern term is artificial intelligence, Jarvis told him. Steve's eyes went wide. They can do that now? He asked. Computers had been enormous monstrosities that took up entire rooms just about in his day, and while he was aware that had changed drastically, he hadn't been aware it had gotten that far. They cannot, for the most part, but Master Stark can, Jarvis corrected him primly. And how crazy was it that a computer sounded prim? That a computer could talk at all? Wow, Steve said, unable to come up with anything more suitable. He got in the elevator with a few of the others and they headed up. Steve discovered when they got up there that they'd been beaten there by a number of people. Thor, of course, who'd only been one building over the entire fight, on the roof. And the woman that was presumably Storm standing beside him, chatting amiably with Thor, who looked thoroughly pleased with whatever they were talking about. But then, from what Steve had seen of the man, pleased seemed to be Thor's default expression. Loki was standing near Thor, next to a wall, watching the room with one eye and talking to apparently no one. It took a second, and Jarvis responding to something Loki said, for Steve to realize Loki was talking to Jarvis. The other people in the room, though, resulted in another bout of staring. Because one of them had wings. Enormous, gorgeous, white feathered wings. And the other, well, frankly defied description. Blue, short-furred, a tail, and very oddly constructed hands and feet. Darn it, Steve, really? really wanted pencil and paper right now. He distracted himself by turning and setting his shield against the wall so he wasn't carrying it around like an idiot, then headed over to... Darn, what had their names been? Angel. Boy, did he understand that code name now. And... Nightcrawler, that was it. Unfortunately, Steve couldn't remember if Tony had mentioned their names. He'd mentioned Hank's name because the man was a fellow scientist, if in a completely different field than the ones Tony was in. Angel and Nightcrawler, right? He asked, holding out a hand to shake. Nice to meet both of you. Angel grinned and shook his hand first. Call me Warren, he said. So you really am? Steve snorted. Yes, I am. Warren grinned again. Sorry, but I had to ask. Because really, what are the odds? Well, Steve could understand it from that perspective. Tell me about it, he said, then turned to Kurt. It is nice to meet you, Captain. My name is Kurt, Kurt said in a clear German accent. Steve, please, both of you, Steve said. He talked to them for a minute before more people arrived. It wasn't until he glanced towards the elevator to see who was coming that he even realized there was another person in the room that he'd missed thanks to gaping at Warren and Kurt. He wandered over that way, even as he nodded at Clint and Natasha, who'd been on the elevator with Hank, who'd had to wait for the elevator to come back down to the lobby as there'd been too many of them to all fit in at once. He managed to talk to everyone in the room for at least a moment before the elevator came up again, revealing Tony, sans suit, with a visibly exhausted Bruce half leaning against him and half being carried. Beside them stood someone that made Steve do a triple take in pure, unadulterated shock. He knew that face. And not from the last month or so he'd been out of the ice. Hunting Hydra bases had been a crazy time. The commandos had worked with a number of other military units from various countries and occasionally individual people who happened to have the specialized skills they needed. One such specialist had been a near-legendary tracker, known as much for his ability to survive despite incredible odds as for his ability to track anyone or anything over any distance or terrain. His name was James Howlett, a sergeant in the Canadian Army. James had worked with them when they'd been trying to find the Poland area bases. Steve had been seriously impressed by James's skills and had tried to recruit him into the commandos, sadly to no avail. He'd got them where they wanted to go, helped, more than a little, wreck the Hydra bases, then gone back to his unit. Still, he'd been with the commandos for about a month solid, and Steve had gotten to know him fairly well in that time. And now, here he was, looking not a day older, dressed in the black leather-looking uniforms that the X-Men used. Steve guessed that explained James' sheer luck in the war if he'd been a mutant. It also, possibly, explained what it looked like bone claws the one time Steve had got sight of them. Though Steve wondered what the heck his mutation was to keep him looking the same 70 years later. Steve practically bounced over as James got out of the elevator, thrilled beyond the telling of it that someone from his side was alive. James, it's good to see you, Steve said, and started to give James a clap on the back and a hugging greeting. Except, he never quite got there. James, who had, oddly, ignored his greeting, suddenly twisted away from him, one fist coming up in an aborted move that had been intended for either a punch or... well, something unpleasant, Steve was sure. What the fuck? James growled at him, glaring at him. It was then that Steve realized there was absolutely no spark of recognition in James's eyes. Granted, it had only been a month, 70 years ago, but surely there'd be at least some sort of recognition on some level. Poland? World War II? Ring a bell? Steve tried. Bob, I don't know you from a hole in the ground, James said, his tone dismissive and almost angry. Steve was rather thoroughly confused. But Hank spoke up then. I am afraid Mr. Logan suffers from a severe case of amnesia, Captain Rogers. He has no memory of his life prior to approximately 15 years ago. About the same time Hank was saying that, Tony piped up. I didn't know him. I don't remember Howard mentioning anyone like him in the commandos. Yeah, I know James, Steve said, And no, he wasn't a commando. Howard never met him because Howard wasn't ever in the field. Well, not after the commandos had formed, anyway. James worked with us for about a month when we were trying to hunt down the Hydra bases in Poland. Then, in a pained voice, "You really don't remember anything? What happened?" "This," James growled and held up a fist. From the space between his knuckles sprouted claws, but absolutely nothing like what Steve remembered seeing that one time. These were metal, smooth and hard, and beyond razor sharp. Steve stared at them in incomprehension for a moment before the pieces clicked together and he added two and two and came up with 4. Someone, somewhere, had tortured James, had done something to him to put metal in him. The implications of it made Steve sick to his stomach. "James," he said, his voice thin. "Your name is James. James Howlett. You're Canadian. You were a sergeant in the Canadian Army when I met you in the war. You were practically legendary for your tracking ability. People called you lucky because you always seemed to come out of the crazy situations not only alive, but without a scratch." Logan hated the black hole that was his memory. It drove him crazy, not knowing who he'd been, what he'd done. He couldn't resist poking at it like a sore tooth, trying to drag anything out of the darkness. Mostly, all he ever got were surreal, blurred memories of being torn apart and molten metal poured into his bones, drowning in a tank and unable to find a way out. Men drinking champagne while he screamed in agony. Fun stuff like that. It had made it easy to just say screw it, and the only thing he was apparently good for: fight! Granted, cage matches were probably a few steps down from what he could have been doing, but what the heck? Rogue had changed all that. A slip of a girl with deadly skin and the biggest, brownest puppy dog eyes he'd ever seen. A girl who, after goodness knows how long on the run, had managed to retain an air of innocent naivete that had made every protective instinct Logan hadn't realized he'd had sit up and take notice. For her sake, he'd forsaken his almost entirely solitary ways. For her sake, he damn near died twice when he'd never given a flying fuck about anyone before that. For her sake, he tried to learn how to function at the mansion, despite the fact most of the people there gave him sideways, disapproving, leery looks as often as not. Or forgot he could hear a pin drop from 100 miles away in a crowd and spoke dismissively of him when they thought he was out of hearing range. He'd even caught a couple of them trying to talk Rogue out of her affection for him. He'd been rather surprised when that had only pissed her off. The fact Rogue liked him, looked to him for protection and safety despite him accidentally skewering her, rocked his world. He hadn't expected that or her complete refusal to walk away from him when she had better role models to look to for those things. He'd sort of given up on trying to find out who he was. Not because he didn't want to know, but because it would take him away from Rogue pretty much permanently. He'd only left the mansion after everything was said and done long enough to head up to his cabin in the Canadian Rockies to get some of his stuff and bring it back to the mansion. The need to know still burned him like acid, even if he was realist enough to know he'd probably never find out. And now, out of nowhere, comes some fresh-faced kid from the 40s who tells him more about himself than he's been able to piece together on his own for 15 years. He really doesn't know what to think about that. Not any of it. Relieved that someone knows that he was evidently a decent person at one point in time. Though he would never admit it. Scared at the implications behind someone from the 40s knowing who he was and where he'd been. He'd known, of course, that he wasn't aging, but with only 15 years of memories to go on, he hadn't really known just how bad it was going to be. If he'd been around in the 40s, clearly old enough to join the military and still looked enough like the man he'd been then now, it meant he pretty much hadn't aged for 70 years. That was not a comforting thought. Unsure what, if anything, to say to Rogers, he just gave a gruff nod, turned, and walked off. Quite a few people watched him go, but he ignored them. He needed somewhere quiet-ish, where he could wrap his head around this.